Hey folks, Dean here from the Magnificast. Recently, Matt and I recorded a conversation that we had based around an interview that I did with Lambert Zuidervaart, a Christian critical theorist from the Institute for Christian Studies. So in that episode, we took some clips from the interview as springboards for our own thoughts about Christianity and the left, and we got to talk about a bunch of cool stuff, but Lambert had a lot more to say that we couldn't include for the sake of time in the conversation. So we're going to post just the whole original interview that I did in full, unedited. So you get to hear the creaky chair that I sat in, some quality microphone bumps. It's like you're right there with us. So a little context for the interview. Lambert was here in Toronto to deliver his exaugural address from the Institute for Christian Studies. So he's retiring after a pretty solid tenure here at the Institute, which means we got to talk a little bit about that address and some of the things that he said in it. And then also, it might help to know that Lambert's most recent research has been on the topic of truth, so you'll hear us chat a little bit about that and some kind of related themes as well. So more generally, we talked about everything from post-truth politics to Betsy DeVos, and then, all the things that we already said in our interview conversation that we did as episode 8 of the Magnificast. So I think there's a lot more worth exploring here, and if you're looking for more from Lambert, we linked some of his essays for free on our blog. So as always, you can support the Magnificast on Patreon, shoot us an email or tweet us, or write a letter to us, write an encyclical, train your carrier pigeon, whatever you want. Tell us how wrong we are, or more likely how right we were about something that we said in an episode. And anyway, without further ado, here's my chat with Lambert Zuidervaart. So last night, Lambert, you gave the exaugural address at the Institute for Christian Studies, where you taught for several years. And I was curious, in that address, you said something about post-truth politics and that situation that we find ourselves in today. Mm-hmm. So, because this is a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics, and you're a Christian intellectual who's thought for a long time about thinkers on the left, I wonder if you could say a little bit about what that situation means to you of post-truth politics, how you think we ought to relate to that, and how do you think we got here?
Right. So I'll talk about how we got here, and then we can maybe go into what to do about it later.
Yeah, sure.
But one could see the clouds on the horizon years ago if one was paying attention. And those clouds were in the intellectual world to begin with. And it really goes back to a shift away from a certain narrow understanding of truth, which equates it with factual accuracy, and thinks that that's all that matters in terms of what we need to achieve when we acquire knowledge. That emphasis has a label. It's a label of positivism, and there was a turn against positivism in the 60s already, and a move towards post-positivism in philosophy of science, and a development of sort of alternative emphases in philosophy and in other fields. But it really gathered a lot of steam in the 80s and 90s with the development of so-called postmodernism, which put a very strong emphasis on the relativity of any claims, and the fact that there's always going to be power mixed into the claims that people make. Now it's really exploded into mainstream culture to the point where ordinary folks think that either there's no factual truth to be established, or if there is any factual truth, it really boils down to one person's opinion against somebody else's opinion. And then when that gets parlayed into politics, it becomes very dangerous, because there no longer is a basis on which people can debate public policy or take certain kinds of evidence seriously, and it's used by people in various political camps as simply a way of dismissing facts, dismissing accuracy. And if that becomes the mode of operation, it really means that whoever has the power carries the day. And as we know, going way back to Plato's Republic, if that's the way you think politics needs to operate, then you no longer have in the horizon any possibility of striving for justice and striving for equity and the like. Because even justice, equity, solidarity, all those values simply become matters of mere opinion. And then it's just whoever has the power carries the day. So that's where we're at. And so it's a problem for everybody. It's a problem for Republicans, obviously. It's a problem for Democrats. It's a problem for progressives who aren't aligned with the Democratic Party.
So it's interesting to kind of trace it back to that intellectual heritage. Do you think this is a case where some intellectuals were sort of exhibiting symptoms of something that was coming, or do you think that they've shaped public discourse in a certain way? And do you feel as though the loss of truth in a kind of, sort of positivist sense as a naive belief or something like that, do you think that's sort of an inevitably net bad, or do you think that, there might be something to it in the same way that other postmodernists tried to continue to think about things like justice and solidarity, but without that sort of, heavy-handed concept or something?
Well, I think that factual accuracy and making correct assertions are still very, very important. And so to dismiss those or to minimize them is problematic. But if you're going to have factual accuracy and esoteric correctness, as I describe it, as part of what you emphasize in a culture, then you also need, at the philosophical level, at the scholarly level, some account for it and some account for why it's important. And that's what we're lacking now. We don't have a good account of that kind of truth, and we don't have a good account of why it's important. So I think that without an emphasis on factual accuracy and the correctness of assertions, the academic enterprise itself loses its entire reason for existence. I mean, the academic enterprise has to be about more than simply achieving factual accuracy, but it has to minimally be about achieving factual accuracy. And so if that goes out the window, then we don't really have a rationale for academic work or universities or scientific research. And these things, despite all the problems that are attached to them, are crucial in the kind of society we inhabit. And it's very disturbing to see politicians simply dismiss the very, very careful, laborious, painstaking, self-sacrificial work that people have done in biology, in physics, in chemistry, in psychology, and so on and so forth, to come up with some notion of what's at stake in the things that are going on in our society. It's very disturbing. So I think, factual accuracy remains very important. But that also means we need a better account for it.
Yeah, it's so interesting. One thing that I've found very interesting being your student at the Institute is I'm, sort of young enough to where my points of contemporary reference are postmoderns, Derrida and Foucault and all the rest of them. And so when I got to the Institute and took your class on theories of truth, I thought, well, I've never really felt like this was a problem for me. I felt like things like justice were problems.
Right.
Things like power were problems.
Right.
And in fact, that's why I sort of wanted to sideline questions of truth in my own work, because I thought, well, anytime someone starts saying they've got the facts, that's a power grab, right? I'm a good Foucauldian in that way.
Right.
And so I wonder, I would guess a lot of people who listen to this podcast are probably aware of those kinds of debates.
Right.
And many progressive sort of American Christians are good readers of people like John Caputo and popularizers of those kinds of discourses. So how would you sort of speak to that anxiety about, factual truth is clearly very important in an age of alternative facts, but at the same time, people are nervous about talking about truth because they feel like it's sort of, just another way of masking power.
Yeah. No, I understand that worry. And Foucault himself, I think, is ambivalent about these matters, and I think at different times in his life he actually said different things about truth and how truth is mixed up with power. So I don't think Foucault himself is very clear on these matters. But I think there's a way of reading Foucault, which has become the dominant way of reading him, that here's a power play behind every truth claim. Okay. If there is a power play involved in every truth claim, that means also that there's a power play in every appeal to any value whatsoever. And if that's the case, then there's really no basis for a critique, at least not a normative critique of society. All you can do is, get upset about power. But why?
Right.
What's wrong with it? Or if you don't think power in itself is wrong, what is the problem? At what point does power become illegitimate? In order to answer that, you have to have some strong notion of justice and solidarity and so on and so forth. And you have to be able to make truth claims with respect to those matters. So there has to be a way of getting out of simply suspecting power all the time. There has to be a way of getting to the point where you can critique power, critique illegitimate uses of power. And I think that requires strong truth claims.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great segue into talking about what we should do in a post-truth society, and from where we might make such a normative critique,
right.
From where we might find, the hinge point of something like justice or solidarity.
Yeah.
And that's something you spend a lot of time thinking about. So here we are, post-truth society. The Democrats didn't save us from Donald Trump.
Right.
What are we to do?
Right. Well, I work at the level of generality for the most part, right? Mm-hmm. So I have very little to advise about specific measures to take. But I could say something in a general way that would be relevant to the more particular actions that people need to take. I think at this point, at least in American society, the real alternatives are to be found not in formal politics, but in what I call civil society. So in all these organizations and movements and so on that are, up in arms, resisting, protesting, organizing, that's where the movement towards a new politics can emerge. And it will take years and years for that to take shape in a formal politics. I mean, these dominant political parties have been entrenched for so long that it would take a long time for them to become unentrenched, but it will happen eventually. But for it to happen, there has to be this continual surge from civil society towards something different, which I think has to involve a primacy given to concerns of ecology, a primacy given to concerns about, well, I'll say income inequality, but it's bigger than that. Concerns about an economy which, in order to operate, has to continually channel public goods, collective goods, into the pockets of people who are already wealthy. Mm-hmm. So it's a systemic problem. It's not just a matter of making a few adjustments in the tax code or something like that. So those two things, at least, an ecological concern and a concern about the very structure of capitalism. I think those have to be at the center of a new politics, which I think has to emerge out of the informal political sphere and finally come to shape in a more formal way.
Yeah. I want to circle back to that later on in a different context. And for now, I think it might be interesting to stay with what you're very good at, what you were just saying, these kind of general, conceptual problems and levels. Yeah. And you've done a lot of work creating vocabularies by which we can talk about systemic problems. And, we're not sort of lost in the minutia of all the things that happen every single day. And you're trying to sort that out.
Yeah.
And could we talk a little bit about what you mean by how you think that we need to be able to give what you call an architectonic critique of society?
Right.
There's a lot of things sort of wrapped up in that, but if we could sort of find one place to start, the place I find most interesting is what you call societal evil.
Yeah.
So if you could kind of explain what you mean by that, and the reason I ask you to start there is I find it a very good conceptual handle to for myself to kind of understand what's happening. And I would hope that would be a way that other people could sort of find a way to use your work and see what's going on around us.
Yeah.
So
the notion of societal evil is one that I've developed in order to get at the kind of problem that Adorno and Horkheimer were addressing in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, and that Adorno continued to struggle with right through the 50s and 60s until he died in 1969. So he agonized about how to do philosophy after Auschwitz. He agonized about whether we can write poetry after Auschwitz. After Auschwitz becomes a kind of a moniker for the situation in which he thinks, society and culture in general in the West finds itself. Auschwitz is a very, very difficult, the Holocaust is a very, very difficult, large-scale atrocity to understand. How could it occur?
Right.
Why did people do that? And who do you hold responsible for it? And how, right? It's all, in order to account for something at that level, you have to be able to talk about how certain patterns of conduct and attitude and disposition, behavior, come together, entrench themselves in a society, in what I call cultural practices and social institutions, and become so enmeshed in the very fabric of the society that's A, hard to recognize, B, hard for anybody to take responsibility for it, because it's basically like the air we breathe, and C, for anybody to resist it. And that's what I'm trying to get at. And so, for me, the kind of patterns that we have in place with respect to so-called environment, to our biosphere, is a manifestation of societal evil. It's such an deeply entrenched set of patterns. It's extremely difficult,
right,
to recognize, to take responsibility for, and then to effectively resist. Same thing with the economy. The disparities in the economy between those who have and those who have not, and the way that the economy depends on that disparity, is so entrenched that it's very hard for anybody to take any kind of personal or even collective responsibility for it. But somebody's got to be responsible for it, right?
Right.
Otherwise, it's just a fate that we live with, and we have to throw up our hands.
Right.
So that's what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, and that's also what I find so helpful about it, because intuitively, especially when you're kind of a young person and you're slowly learning about all the ways in which you are complicit in a society that, doesn't seem to value and affirm equitable life, it's hard to even start thinking about that. And then when you do start feeling sort of paralyzed by the magnitude of the problem and the ways in which you're involved in that problem, contributing to it, reproducing it, and you couldn't do otherwise because the mode of production is such that you're stuck with it, right?
That's right.
So I think what I find most useful about how you approach these things is that it helps to avoid a certain kind of cynicism, because it lets you actually think about it. And I think there's a temptation among leftist intellectuals generally to kind of feel like if you're not thinking, if you're not doing and you're just thinking, then you're contributing to the problem. But I think what you do very well is to say, well, if you're not thinking about it, then your doing is just going to keep getting stuck in the same patterns, right? And so maybe you could say a little more about from where someone might think about how to critique something like societal evil, such that it doesn't just lodge you in a, well, I know better now, so I've done something, right? Yeah.
And this is where Adorno and I part company, as it were, because Adorno, famous phrase from Adorno in version of Hegel, the whole is the false.
Right.
The whole is the false. Well, if the whole is the false, then the question is, what are the alternatives? Everything is false. But I don't think Adorno meant everything is false. He meant the whole is the false. But within the whole that is false, there are traces of something else. And then you have to be able to find those traces, right? But even that, to me, is insufficient. Traces of the good aren't good enough. And I have a more robust view of what's good in society and where the alternatives can emerge. So I've tried to develop an approach where I can point to how existing institutions, existing structures, despite and amid the distortions, nevertheless have the potential for something better, if in fact they are redirected. But then there has to be a way of saying how they should be redirected. And for that, you can't just have a pragmatic answer. It can't be just, what works better. It has to be normative in some way. And so I've tried to develop a way of talking about the state and the economy and civil society as three macro structures, each of which has a certain task to be pursued, each of which is also failing adequately to perform that task because of normative deficiencies. So to make it too simple, but the normative deficiency of the administrative state is that it is not truly an institution for justice in the public realm. That's its task, but it more often than not fails to carry through on that task, and ends up being simply an institution that distributes and enforces power relations. And same thing with the economy. The economy, the capitalist economy now, as the mainstream economy, I think has a normative task taking care of the resources of our lives and of the creation in a way that contributes to flourishing across the board. Well, it does some of that, but it does it inadvertently because what it's really aimed at is private profit,
right,
and efficiency and so on and so forth. So there's a distortion of its normative calling, and yet in that it's still doing some of this. It is taking care of some things, and some things better and some things worse. So it's not like it's completely caught up in a societal evil that's irremediable. And it's the same thing with civil society. I think our civil society has a lot of problems because whereas it should be sort of inculcating a robust solidarity towards others, it tends to emphasize a kind of charity and tolerance, and that's not enough. So once you recognize that there's something to be said about each of these structures and something at the same time to be said in a critical vein, then you can start also talking about how to work for the good of these structures and how to mitigate what is not so good. But then, of course, the other part of it, and this is where I use the language of differential transformation, is that change in one of those structures can only happen when change in the other structure also occurs. So it has to happen somehow in sync. And that's where you get to a very large-scale picture that most people find, quote, unrealistic, or maybe even utopian. Well, I admit that it will take generations. If this is going to happen, it's going to take generations for it to happen. But given the level at which the problems are pitched, given how entrenched the societal evil is, I don't see any alternative. I think long-term change is required.
Yeah. Well, that makes me wonder about sort of expected leftist worries about that kind of approach, insofar as it can come off as being a kind of reformist, very patient process, which in some ways the strength of it is that it is very honest about the challenges that are present in a society. But the challenge, so we had Derek Ford, member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, on not too long ago. We were asking him about the Democratic Socialists of America, right? So they're a kind of interest organization for the most part. They're trying to sort of push more progressive candidates in the Democratic Party, but they also organize outside of that for other kinds of causes. But they're not a party in themselves, and they're certainly not a revolutionary organ in the same way that the PSL would be. Okay. And, Derek sort of said, yeah, well, the DSA, I'm glad that they exist. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing, but at the end of the day, he's a Leninist. So you're not going to change things through bourgeois means, right? And there's some of that I sometimes wonder with your work where, so we have things like the state, we have things like a capitalist economy. And do you think there's a sense in which, we shouldn't necessarily be beholden to those things that have emerged, but in fact, maybe we'd be better off without some of them or with a complete and radical restructuring of them in a certain way?
Yeah. Well, revolution isn't what it used to be.
That's true.
I mean, that was what the Frankfurt School was wrestling with in the 20s and 30s already. Once you have and this is, after the imperialist war of the First World War. Once you have a capitalist economy as sophisticated and complicated and interwoven with the academy, interwoven with people's ordinary lives, heavy consumption and so on and so forth, it's not the kind of economy you can just overthrow, no matter what kind of political moves you make. So that's the problem. And Marx himself, when he tried to understand social revolution, taking the French Revolution as his sort of primary example, indicated that economic revolution is a very slow process. I mean, there comes a point in his language where the relations of production and the forces of production are so out of sync with each other that there's a possibility of dramatic change. But to get to that point takes hundreds of years. And it's not clear to me that we're anywhere close to that point in the global capitalist economy. So that's part of the problem. I mean, how to theorize revolution. A political revolution will only be as good, I think, as the conditions being ripe economically for it. And I don't see it. Mm-hmm. But that's where we can have discussions.
Right.
People on the left need to have that discussion. But then I think the other part of the discussion has to be a revolution to what end? What is the societal good, or what is the good society that the revolution is for?
Right.
It can't just be overthrowing what's bad. You have to actually have some vision of what's good. And that's what I'm also trying to offer when I talk about the way these various institutions need to be playing a role together in a society that actually contributes to interconnected flourishing, to use my own jargon.
Yeah, and that reminds me, I wanted to ask you, so this is sort of the circling back I wanted to do in this context, to the question earlier about, what are we supposed to do? And it's difficult to sort of put practice and theory together. But when you talk about people like Adorno and Horkheimer and your relationship to things like revolutionary change, spelling out a different kind of vision, etc., one thing that I think is very helpful about your approach is that you do try to do the very hard work of, building an alternative that seems sort of reasonable, and no matter how far off it might be, at least you could think really hard about that. And that would set you up to have conversations about, whether or not bourgeois means are a way to get there.
Right.
And I sort of want to talk a little bit about how your Christian convictions play into that sort of motivation. So you don't always wear those on your sleeve, I think strategically for a good reason, right? Because you're winning a very good hearing. But there's a deep sort of eschatological pulse in your work.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. How does your Christianity feed into and motivate those conversations on the left that you're intervening in?
So there are two very fundamental, I'll call them theological. I don't usually talk the language of theology. But there are two theological convictions that sustain all my social philosophy. One is that, in principle, the creation is good. Or to put it more theologically, God created the heavens and the earth and declared them good. So that's really a very strong theological conviction. And the other one is that where history is headed in the long term is toward what's called the new heaven and the new earth. That for me is not pie in the sky, in the sweet by and by. That is really a vision of a new society. And I think that's also the case in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Scriptures. That's what the language I used in my talk last night was, the messianic condition. That there's a really strong sense in the chronologically later writings in Scripture that everything is headed towards a messianic condition when the wolf and the lamb lie down together, right? Well, that for me means part of the task of a Christian social philosopher is to try to envision what a new earth would be like, given current conditions, given the kind of society we're in right now. What would a new earth look like if we could move from where we're at right now to something that is better for everything, for everyone and everything. What would that look like? Well, for clues about that, of course, I'm going to pay attention to what philosophers and political theorists and economists and so on and so forth have said about what makes for human flourishing and creational flourishing. But I'm also going to take very, very seriously what I can find in the scriptures of the Hebrew and Christian traditions. And there, that, my talking about justice and solidarity and resourcefulness, that all comes out of scriptural sources, even though I don't indicate that all the time.
Right.
But the resourcefulness is my way of translating a notion of stewardship, which is very strongly articulated in the work of Bob Goudsvaart, Dutch Calvinist, social and economic philosopher, and a trained economist. And that notion of stewardship has currency now, I think, also more broadly among Protestants and Catholics alike, and probably in the Orthodox tradition as well, the Eastern Orthodox. Mm-hmm. But I find the term stewardship itself problematic, partly because it sounds sectarian, although even corporations now use the language of stewardship. They never miss an opportunity to somehow tie into what seems to have cachet.
You got to market to those niches.
Yeah. But resourcefulness too has problems, because if you're a Heideggerian, you think, well, you're just talking about Gestell, the framing of everything. Everything's been talked into everything's been turned into resources for a technological society, and so on and so forth. That's obviously not the way I mean it.
Right.
So I haven't been able to find one single term to do what needs to be done.
Can't please everybody.
Yeah. But I mean, this sense of taking care of creatures is very, very strong in the Hebrew scriptures. And it's part of what the children of Israel were mandated with. And it gets down to very concrete things like not overworking the soil, giving it a rest, that kind of stuff, which now is coming back into organic farming and so on. So we're actually starting to pick up some of this ancient wisdom as a way of finding alternatives to highly industrialized, highly polluting agribusiness.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find too that the way in which you draw from those kind of scriptural sources seems to set up your eschatological sympathies in a way that's very different from those of someone like Adorno and Horkheimer, mm-hmm. which for them, that kind of redemptive condition that, provides them some sort of glimmers of hope also provides them a kind of, it becomes a sort of depressive realization. It's a lost messianic state that almost they want very badly to believe in, but they can't, for a variety of reasons. And, correct me if I'm wrong, but in your work, I sort of detect something a little less depressive in that way, that the messianic state is actually something that's a little more encouraging, inspiring, inspiriting, rather than something that you would sort of mourn that it's just not here all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, so Adorno uses the language of traces, Spuren, right? It's a little bit like Derrida, actually.
Right.
The justice that is still to come. And I think the reason he and Horkheimer both have such thin views of this nevertheless necessary future is because they don't have a robust normative account of society in the present. They don't have a robust notion of justice. They don't have a robust notion of solidarity. Because they never formulated that kind of robust normative stance to support the critique they launched. They also were not able to project beyond current conditions to a condition when those normative expectations could be realized.
Right.
So it's a problem. For me, it's a problem of normativity. It's a problem of, and this is a problem in the Marxist tradition more broadly. And there's a lot of debate about whether Marx can be made out to have an ethical stance or not. And I understand very well why Marx did not want to talk that language, because the people that were talking that language tended to be idealists, and he thought that simply having the right values or the right ideas would be enough to change society. And of course, that's complete nonsense. But but in going to the historical materialist direction and emphasizing the importance of economic and technological change, he did not work out a very thick normativity to support his critique of capitalism.
Right. Having talked a little bit about how you relate to these other thinkers like Adorno and critical theory generally, and how Christianity plays into your own attempt to think through traditionally leftist problems.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that there is such a thing as, say, the Christian left, in quotes, or do you think there's a certain way of sorting out how Christianity might relate to leftist politics or politics in general? How do you kind of see these two things related in your own life?
Yeah. I don't think there's a Christian left. I think there have been many different ways in which Christians have found themselves aligning with forces on the left. So when I was a young college professor in the 1980s, it was liberation theology that was coming from South America that was really powerful and attractive for Christians who aligned with the left. And in Edmonton, Alberta, where I started teaching at King's University, now King's University, it was King's College then, I quickly found myself affiliated with progressive Catholics who were very much informed by liberation theology, and found myself comfortable with those folks. Those are the folks I hung out with. In fact, Joyce and I were part of a co-op house in the inner city of Edmonton, and some of our progressive Catholics were part of another co-op house, and we joined forces, and I was the founding president of a new co-op called Inroads Housing Cooperative, making inroads in the inner city, which was controlled by absentee landlords. 70% of the people living in the inner city were tenants, and most of them were renting from absentee landlords who were not taking care of their property and charging exorbitant rents. And so we founded a housing cooperative which incorporated these two freestanding cooperative houses, and then started acquiring or building more property, and it's still there, it's still going. But yeah, it was the progressive Catholics and some progressive Calvinists, if you wish, who got that started, because we found that what mattered to us was a liberating of people who were oppressed and on the margins. And that's where we needed to put our energy. And we need to put it in a very, very specific way in the geography where we found ourselves.
Right.
So, but, these things come and go, especially in North America. Fads come and go really quickly. And so, the language of liberation theology seems to have faded from people's consciousness and awareness, and then they go towards other sort of liberatory moments. So feminism has been a very important sort of movement that has attracted people towards a kind of left formulation of theological convictions. I'll just use shorthand. Gay liberation has been another. Part of what I find disturbing in North America is that there seems to be all this identity politics that keeps people from seeing a bigger picture. And so they seem to line up with this cause or that cause and this group or that group. And it's hard for people to actually see a bigger picture about how all this stuff is really dealing in the end with an underlying pattern, underlying oppression, underlying power that affects everyone, right? So that's part of what makes it difficult also for there to be a Christian left, because what ends up happening is Christians jump on one bandwagon or another, and they tend to dissipate their energies that way.
Right. Yeah, it's funny. Matt and I talked a little bit about Jacques Ellul in a previous episode, and we were just sort of struck by how in his book Anarchy and Christianity, there's a lot about his very weird Christianity, but not a lot actually about his commitment to anarchist, labor causes.
Yeah.
And so what you often, or what we seem to have found was there's this anxiety on his part to kind of always worry if he's being Christian enough, but never really an anxiety to worry about if he's, helping the workers enough, which is kind of a strange, identitarian, Christian leftist politics. I think you're right about that.
Yeah.
So, that's one interesting thing about ICS's brand of Calvinism, it seems to me, is that on the one hand, it has a very strong identity. I mean, in the Netherlands, it comes out of arguably a kind of identity politics, mm-hmm. right? So they wanted their own political party, their own social institutions, etc. But then at the same time, ICS's way of taking that up has been not quite so anxious about getting involved with these other kinds of movements. So how do you kind of trace that out, given your own participation in that?
So I grew up, without knowing much about what I'll just call the Reformational movement. I grew up as part of the Dutch immigrant culture in Northern California. Member of the Christian Reformed Church all my life until much later. Went to these schools that were part of the movement. Then went to college, graduate school, got my degree from the Free University. All of that was in the context of a kind of Dutch Calvinist upbringing. But once I went to Berlin and was exposed to a very, very different religious culture and a very, very different kind of left politics. I mean, you talk about Marxists and anarchists. I mean, they were there and they were serious, right? They would disrupt classes. They were, it wasn't just armchair politics. But anyway, that sort of opened my eyes to a much bigger world, a much bigger sense of what the issues are. And once I came back to North America, I wasn't ready to just self-identify again with all the institutions that I grew up in. And I'm not not dismissive at all. Obviously, I've lived my whole life, continue to live my life in the schools that come out of that tradition, and I'm very happily so. But the kind of emphasis on having all the manifestations of your Christianity channeled through organizations that self-identify in a certain way has become much less important for me. And in terms of my own practicing of Christianity, I have not been a member of the Christian Reformed Church for many, many years. And I found myself much more comfortable in the United Church in Canada, which is among the Protestant denominations known as the Social Justice Church. And now in the States, I'm in the Presbyterian Church USA, which also is on the more progressive side politically among Presbyterians.
Right.
So for me, and there's never been the same kind of emphasis on having Christian schools, Christian labor associations, Christian political organizations, and so on among Presbyterians and United Church folks. They don't have that emphasis.
Right.
They have a very strong emphasis on bearing witness in society to the Prince of Peace, if you want to put it that way. But they don't have the same understanding of how that has to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So,
right. Yeah. That's also interesting to me because your own work is so invested in these Dutch Calvinist thinkers, but in practice you found sort of a home in these other traditions.
Yeah.
And it's often funny, when I say, so I'm not a Calvinist myself. I grew up Roman Catholic and, wandered through a variety of the fields of Protestantism for a long time, and we were married in the Episcopal Church, and now I'm Catholic again. Yeah. So anyway, when I tell people that I go to the Institute for Christian Studies, which is a Calvinist school, and I tend to be more vocal about sort of revolutionary sympathies. So then when I then tell them it's a reformational philosophy, those two things seem very contradictory. But nevertheless, I say, well, it turns out there is a very interesting, strange, unexpected kind of leftist strand in Calvinism generally, and especially as mediated through what's called the Reformational tradition. And I wonder if you could sort of speak to that. Why might people be surprised that there are leftist Calvinists? And secondly, how do you think that that's possible?
Yeah. Well, the rap on Calvinism in North America is that it's Puritan, right?
Right.
So it's highly moral and highly sort of judgmental and highly constraining. And in American society, I suppose, And you could explain a lot of things that have happened in the 20th and 21st century as a rebellion against Puritanism. So there's that public image of what Calvinism is all about, which is hard to counteract. But then, more specifically, in the Dutch Kuyperian movement, which is where I come from intellectually, the folks who came out of that and settled in the United States for various reasons, but I think it had to do with a certain translation of the notion of sphere sovereignty, that each social sphere has its own authority. They ended up being Republicans because they thought the state should not be controlling civic life. And they thought that the Democratic Party tended to go in that direction, particularly after the Roosevelt era, when big government really took shape. So they ended up being, and ideologically, many of them were small business people or farmers, and so they also had a very strong sense of being independent and not having their lives dictated by government. So a lot of them ended up being Republicans. Well, if anybody knows about the Christian Reformed Church will realize, of course, the sort of the default position politically in the Christian Reformed Church is republicanism of one sort or another. Not necessarily libertarian republicanism, although some of the more politically prominent people, like Betsy DeVos, actually end up being libertarians. But I think many of the other Republican folks in the Christian Reformed Church are not libertarians. Anyway, in Canada, it's been more of a mixed bag because a lot of the people who came out of the Netherlands and settled here came out in the 50s rather than in the 20s or even earlier in the States. And those folks often were more open to, first of all, they were more open to having government prominently involved in adjudicating matters of social justice and providing for social welfare, because they had already experienced that as a good thing in the Netherlands, supported by their own political party. But even in Canada, there's a wing of the Christian Reformed Church which gravitated towards the Reform Party, which ended up being the dominant strand in the Conservative Party that Harper came out of. Yeah, so there's a split among those folks in Canada as well. You can even see it among the organizations that came out of that Dutch immigration. So the Christian Labour Association of Canada tended to be on political issues much more conservative than Citizens for Public Justice. Right. In fact, Citizens for Public Justice, in a sense, split away from the CLAC. And so they're on different pages politically. Mm-hmm.
So Calvinism is a complicated thing, like anything else.
It is.
Unsurprisingly, I guess.
Yeah.
Since you brought her up, we should talk about Betsy DeVos a little bit, and so far as you can, being someone who still lives in Grand Rapids, under the watchful eyes of the DeVosses. So she's a graduate of Calvin College, where you taught for some time, and there's been, I'm marginally involved in sort of Calvinist culture now by virtue of participating in this institution and others, and living in Grand Rapids myself. And what I've sort of seen on social media, at least, is a lot of my friends who are more social justice minded, because of their formation in that tradition, the Calvinist tradition, are very, quick to say, listen, that's not what we're about, just because she went here, etc. But then there are other folks who say, well, but she is sort of understanding herself within a reasonably traced Calvinist tradition too. So, could you speak to a little bit about that? How does, she's the Secretary of Education now. How does Calvinism, as a right and left movement, sort of respond to that situation?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting case. Betsy DeVos is a smart lady, She's ended up being a libertarian. I think there's nothing, in historic Calvinism, or specifically in historic Kuyperianism, that would steer you into libertarianism. But there is a way of reading that tradition which supports libertarianism if you put all your emphasis on the need to keep government out of interference with other spheres of human life. And if you take that very, very seriously and then find interference all over the place, then you're going to end up being a libertarian. So I think that's how it went. Now, historically, of course, she has been heavily influenced by the Acton Institute, which is part of the Catholic tradition. And they're libertarian, as far as I can tell.
Yeah.
And they're a very forceful presence now in Grand Rapids. And it's interesting because some of these Kuyperians who are suspicious of anything smacking of the left, and there are some, have ended up cozying up to the Acton Institute.
Right. But it's odd because presumably you would, if you're a good Kuyperian, you would have just the same amount of worry about the economic sphere sort of encroaching in your life, right? Yeah, so it's a sort of pick and choose.
Exactly. Yeah. Which sphere are you going to consider the dominant one?
Yeah.
And how is it interfering with the other ones?
Yeah. I'm waiting for the anti-family Kuyperians. That's what the anti-church Kuyperians.
Yeah. Well, some people would say Kuyper himself was anti-church because he had a very weak understanding of organized worship. So anyway, I think it's very hard actually to account for anybody's political stance simply from one angle. Right. So Betsy DeVos studied at Calvin College. Well, what did she pick up at Calvin College, and from whom? I mean, there are a lot of professors at Calvin College who would have nothing to do with the kind of policies that she's trying to advance and are very critical of it. Did she not study with any of those folks? Well, of course, she's old enough that she wouldn't have studied with many of them because they came later. But even the ones that were around when she was a student, like Nick Walterstorff, I mean, he would never support that kind of stuff, right? I mean, and he was one of the prominent professors at the time that she was at Calvin College.
Right.
So she's obviously picked up things from many other sources as well.
Right.
And she's been very prominent in Republican politics for a long time. So I think Calvin College, in terms of its faculty, has been middle of the road for at least 40 or 50 years politically, with a good number of people who are more leftward leaning. Very few people who actually are very far right. Students is a different question. Students come from whatever homes they were trained in, whatever schools they went to, and so that's a different question. But the faculty is by no means a faculty that lines up with the right wing of the Republican Party.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so maybe we can find a way to close off our interview bringing all these things together a little bit. So I'll ask you to do, the thing that you're just not supposed to ask theoreticians to do, which is to, see if you might have any kind of advice, having inculcated a long spirit of Christian sources, leftist political sources, philosophical sources, but also, you have been involved in real organizing on the ground, not just in the tennis association you were talking about earlier, but a variety of things like the Urban Institute for Contemporary Arts in Grand Rapids is a very political body, all these kinds of things. So, for Christians today who are dissatisfied with what's on offer, and especially Christians who are worried about what's going to happen in the next, couple of years with congressional elections, the general election, etc. What are we supposed to do? The standard leftist wisdom is don't worry about those elections, get busy somewhere else. I wonder, what do you think?
So I guess it was Jacques Ellul who said, think globally and act locally. And I think that's still good advice. I think it's really important to get involved in something local which you can see is making a difference, but also is aligning in a helpful way with larger patterns beyond the local scene, whatever that means, whether it be in community agriculture or whether that be social work, whatever. Because then that gives you a way to contribute in a very specific locale to some kind of change. So that's part of it. But I think the acting locally needs to also be done for the sake of what's global. In other words, it's easy to just get caught up in activism and just do what needs to be done because the tasks are right in front of you. They're so obvious. But especially people who are intellectuals or cultural leaders of one sort. I think if their local involvement has to still have a more global horizon to it, and that's tricky. And I think I kept reminding myself when I was involved in the Urban Institute of Contemporary Arts. This is one institution in one city, but what we're doing here could have significance beyond it, and we need to keep that in mind, for better or worse. Mm-hmm. And the patterns that we influence on the local scene, and it's obvious that we did, because that entire area, which was pretty run down, and a lot of people wouldn't go there because they felt it was dangerous. By virtue of us creating an art center, has changed. We weren't the only organization, but we were an anchor organization, and now all kinds of stuff is happening there. And of course, the real estate values have gone up. A lot of the homeless people, street people, are no longer comfortable there. So that's one of the things that we were very aware of when we were putting that art center together, that there's got to be a way somehow to include the folks who are on the margins and make our organization welcoming and interactive for them. So it affected the design of the building. So we found out that buildings that have an imposing facade or steps leading up to them and so on are less inviting for street people. They won't go into them. They don't feel safe. So we made sure that it was a street level entrance, glass you could see through, you could see what you're walking into, all that stuff. We hired teams of local people to do the mosaic work with the guidance of a very fine mosaic artist in the sidewalk outside. So we were very aware that what we were doing was going to create patterns that could be actually unhelpful for the people on the margins. We also were aware that it's something that's out of our control. Real estate markets being what they are. This pattern repeats itself over and over again. The artists go into the rundown areas, the property values start going up, and then the development starts. And then the people who could live there because the real estate values were down in the dumps are forced out.
Right.
Anyway, but so acting locally with a global sense of why what you're doing is important and how it might contribute.
Right.
Whatever that means, for people in their specific circumstances.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that general principled advice. That's a good academic way of getting into it, I think, in a helpful, positive sense. Yeah. Is there anything at the end, do you have a project you want to plug or something? I know that you have a book coming out. So,
well, I'm still working on this truth project, and I want to get it finished. The other project I wanted to do, but I'm not sure I will ever do it, is actually a book on the theories of globalization, in which I would try to make sense of the patterns of economic globalization and how they interact with culture and politics. And then I would like to propose a way of having the various world religions contribute to a global ethic. So this interreligious dialogue that everybody's into actually could have a significance for the long-term future of the Earth. So that's what I would like to think about, but I'm not sure I'm going to have the energy or the time or the patience to turn it into any kind of book or series of books. But
right.
Anyway.
Right. Well, podcast listeners on the edge of their seats, hopefully they'll be able to, buy the rest of your books such that you at least have the financial means to consider such a project. Right. So. Well, good. Yeah. Thanks so much for being here. Yeah, that was really great.
Okay, thanks.